Welcome into the third ever episode of Canadian Basketball Weekly. I am your host, Elliot Russenholt. You're listening to this on the Maple Minute. It's been Christmas. It's been New Year's. It's happy holiday season. Happy holidays to everybody. Hope everybody was safe and enjoyed themselves and everything was great. Obviously, we were off last week. There wasn't too much to talk about. I mean, I could go back and, recap some games. But obviously, it's older news now, so really no point in doing that. But we do have some basketball coming up, and we'll get to it in a minute. There was some games in the last week with college basketball. Obviously, the NBA still rolling. The NCAA kind of some teams playing some meaningful games. Some teams just playing some games to make sure that they're still in rhythm for once they get going once again here for conference play very soon. So yeah, we're going to get into the show right away. And we're going to start off with the first segment that we always start with. Jumping right into things here. Because there was some significant news here in terms of the NBA, in terms of a transaction that was made, and also in terms of how this transaction affects the one and only Canadian team in the NBA, but also will impact the country in a sense. Canadian darling, I'm going to call him Canadian darling, RJ Barrett has returned home to Toronto in a trade with the New York Knicks. So, OG Anunoby, Precious Achiuwa, and Malachi Flynn of the Toronto Raptors were traded to the New York Knicks for RJ Barrett, Emmanuel Quickley, and a 2024 second-round pick that was originally the worst team in the league, Detroit Pistons. We're going to get to Barrett and how important that is in a minute, but I just want to say I think the Raptors did really well in this trade. They got some good pieces back, obviously. They got essentially a late first-round pick with the Detroit second, essentially going to be the first pick of the second round. With the Raptors kind of struggling this year, maybe they find their footing with Barrett and with Quickley, but we'll see. If obviously it might take a little bit of time for them to gel, but I actually think that it's a better thing if they don't, because then they're going to have a boatload of draft picks. It means their pick is earlier, then they have a late second. Hopefully they make another trade, maybe offload. This isn't turning into a Raptors podcast, I swear. If they offload Siakam or whatever the case is, the distant future might be looking a little bit brighter in Toronto. I do want to touch on bringing in Emmanuel Quickley. I love him. I think he's a great player. He's been great with the Knicks. It just, as soon as they signed Jalen Brunson, that kind of stopped the turn of Quickley potentially being the starter. And obviously Brunson's been a great signing. He's been a great player for the Knicks. He's led them to the playoffs and he's been fantastic. But at the same point, Quickley's younger. He's on a cheaper contract, essentially. You could throw that money that you had at Brunson elsewhere. But it was clear that even though he had been off the bench, he was a Sixth Man of the Year candidate. I believe he did win it last year, or at least he was a candidate. Don't quote me on it. I'm all jumbled with my awards recently with the NBA. But when it comes to Quickley being a starter, it just wasn't going to happen in New York, even though he's shown them that he can be a starter. So getting that in Toronto, he got the start right away. Like, Toronto brought him in to start. Obviously, we've now talked about that second round pick, and we've talked about Quickley. So now there's nobody else to talk about other than the most recent best player to come out of Canada that is in the NBA. It's RJ Barrett. He is the NBA Canadian of the Week because he's now playing for the only Canadian team in the NBA. And not to say that he's a bad, I'm not trying to say that obviously people have their opinions on RJ Barrett. I actually don't think he's a bad player. I thought he's had a good surge this year. He's been a little bit more efficient. He's shown that he can be probably a second, third option on most championship winning teams, or at least playoff contending teams for sure. He's maybe a 3 option on a championship team. But other than that, he's where he's supposed to be. He's back home. He did say in an interview recently, I apologize for whoever did the interview. I believe it might have been in the press conference, and so I apologize for who asked the question. But he was asked, "Do you think you could have been here when you were drafted at 19 years old?" He said he was not ready to be in his hometown. He now says at 23, he is ready to be the face of his hometown team, and he will be the face. Me and everybody else at the Maple Minute were talking about it the other day, soon after the trade went down, and I made the comment that yes, Scotty Barnes has been the face of the team, and he's been getting all the commercials, and that will now change because you now have a Canadian quote unquote star, a Canadian player that is shown that he has star potential on the team. As much as Scotty is American, and he's a great player. He's probably the best player on the Raptors if you want to debate that. If maybe you say Siakam, but I personally think it's Scotty Barnes. And yes, he gets all the commercials and he is the face of the team, but it really will now be RJ Barrett. He will be the front facing of this franchise. And I think obviously it makes sense. If you can play in New York, survive in New York, you can play anywhere in any league, anywhere in the world. So for RJ Barrett to be back home and now potentially be the face of his hometown team, the team he grew up cheering for, I think that's really cool. Now, I will say, I think he's pulling a little bit of wool over the media's eyes, saying that he wouldn't have been ready at 19. If he was ready to kind of take over the reins in New York, and obviously he was up and down in New York, but he didn't really have too many issues with the media and being the face of that New York Knicks franchise. So if he could do it in New York at 19, I think he would have been ready to do it in Toronto. I think it would have been different if he'd struggled in New York and then he'd come home. But yeah, Toronto and New York are probably the two hardest media cities in the world, and at least in North America. I should preface that being North America, especially in sports. But yeah, I'm happy RJ Barrett is home. Again, I'm not a Raptors fan. I will say that. This isn't a Raptors podcast. This is about just Canadian basketball. And I'm not a Raptors fan either. But I do really like the trade for the Raptors, what it brings to Toronto in terms of merchandise sales and draw to the team. I'm pretty sure it looked like it on the broadcast when they played the Cavaliers the other night. They get a 133-131 win. I believe that was the score. And it looked like a sold out house. And I'm sure that will happen. I know they've been having some lower attendances recently just because the team hasn't been great. But if they're starting to surge, then it should continue. Yeah, Barrett had 19 points, 9 rebounds. Quickly had 14, 6 rebounds, and 3 assists in that win against the Cavs. They pulled away early. I was watching this game. I normally don't watch Raptors games too much unless they're playing the Rockets. But yeah, I watched this game because it's a pretty significant moment for Canadian basketball. And yeah, Barrett, I thought, played well, quickly had a good start. They seemed like there was a couple moments, and I won't say many. The broadcast was very adamant about, they need to work on their chemistry. Obviously, the 3 others in the starting lineup, Barnes, Pirtle, and Siakam, all have chemistry. And then obviously Barrett and Quickly, having played together in New York for the last 2-3 seasons, have chemistry. So obviously you could see that on display when there were certain plays. Barrett seemed to kind of figure it out with him and Scotty, and good chunk with Pirtle, and Quickly and Pirtle seem to be a pretty good mix. So we'll see how that goes in the future. But I didn't really see too many chemistry issues as much as the broadcast was trying to say. I thought that team looked all right. And they obviously beat a good Cavs team that won, I believe it was either 3 of their last 4 or 4 in a row. They were a pretty good team, even without Darius Garland and Evan Mobley. The Raptors do take on the Memphis Grizzlies tonight, Wednesday night, if you're not watching this the day it is released. And yeah, we'll continue to see how this team gels. Finally, now, after that huge, long segment, that's probably longest I've done in that segment so far. We're only 3 episodes in, but we're going to now move on to the NCAA Canadian Standout of the Week. It was a tough choice. There were a couple good plays from last night. Obviously, I'm going to shout out Elijah Fisher. He had a pretty good game for DePaul against the Yukon Huskies. It's the number 5 ranked Huskies. It's DePaul. He had a pretty okay game. There wasn't really much else to say about that. But that isn't our Canadian stand of the week. Our Canadian stand of the week is from this past Saturday. Xavier Lee had 18 points and 4 assists and an 84-82 win over a good Delaware team. A team that will probably challenge, most likely, I would assume, challenge for a NCAA tournament spot in their conference, probably trying to compete for a conference tournament championship to get that automatic berth. But Delaware is going to be a pretty good team. So for Princeton to get a 2-point victory, that's pretty good. Princeton now 12-1. They were really good last year. Obviously, they upset Arizona, and I believe they also had an upset in the second round as well. They made to the Sweet 16 last year, getting out of the first weekend. So Princeton should be good, especially with, I believe most of that team came back, plus Lee is taking this jump. So Princeton is a mid-major team, and there's always an Ivy League team that looks good every year, obviously. Princeton, again, I would say is the cream of the crop of the Ivy League. Harvard has crept up, and obviously Yale has a couple of good years, but Princeton is the cream of the crop in the Ivy League. And, Xavier Lee might be the reason that Princeton is a 11 or 10 seed and surprises somebody. But yeah, good win over a good Delaware team who obviously doesn't have Jameer Nelson Jr. anymore. He's at TCU, which I believe is correct. Or was that where he committed to TCU. But yeah, Jameer Nelson Jr. not there anymore, but still a good team. They're 8-4. So they will probably be competing. I don't remember what conference they are in, but they were competing for an automatic berth into the NCAA tournament. So 2 weeks ago, as we move into the next segment here, 2 weeks ago, we had a player spotlight. And because there wasn't too much basketball in terms of the high school level, because we've now moved on to the high school prep player spotlight, because it was kind of quiet the last little bit. I'm actually going to spotlight an entire tournament. The Sugar Bowl tournament in Alberta, hosted by Raymond High School. Fantastic event, looked absolutely buzzing. Even in the third place game, looked nuts. I caught the third place game and the championship. Some pretty good basketball. And yeah, I must say, I know I'm from Manitoba, and people from Manitoba who do listen in or watch these videos will understand that the gym, if I were to pull up a picture of the gym at Raymond, it was pretty cool. They had a really cool scoreboard, double-sided stands, looked like a pretty large gym. But yeah, in the final, it was the host Raymond Comets, and they took on Medicine Hat High School. It was a victory for the host team in the championship, 77-74. It was a really good game, really back and forth. Medicine Hat had the lead for a good chunk of the first half, and then the Comets just ended up taking over, and they win this one. So shout out to the Sugar Bowl. We had some coverage, and we've posted about a couple of players playing in some schools in that tournament. So if you want to check out some film from that tournament and or check out some prospects, go and follow us at the Maple Minute on all socials. We finally have a dedicated page for that as well, for all of our scouting stuff. So yeah, follow us on all socials at the Maple Minute. I really should have it instead of my Twitter, but follow me on my Twitter at Elliot Russenholt. I also have it in my bio if you can't find it. So you can just head to my Twitter right down there, and you will be able to get to that page. The honey hole for all things Canadian basketball recruiting. Now, like I had mentioned 2 weeks ago before the break, we did a U Sports Roundup. I believe that was in the first episode. We're now back on the U Sports content because it was gone last week or 2 weeks ago. And obviously, there was nothing last week. It hasn't started yet. There was a tournament over the Christmas break, but we will get to that here in a moment. We will shout out a team from that tournament. But with U Sports basketball back up and running, I do want to do, as we always do, we go from NBA to the NCAA we'll get back to U Sports, and then we will then get to the high school and prep spotlight but we're going to start our way back up here. No real crazy high school stuff just yet. Probably next week for sure once schools reopen. But yeah, this weekend, there's some really good matchups in the U Sports, specifically the OC, oh my goodness, I can't even speak. The OUA, couple really good matchups here on Friday. There is number 1 University of Ottawa. The GGs are taking on number 3 Queen's University. That should be a huge matchup. If you're in the area, I would most definitely go and check that out. That is going to be a fantastic game, especially after, again, and we'll get to that tournament in a minute, some of the results that happened in that tournament. I will also note that Ontario Tech and Carleton also take each other on Friday, and then they swap opponents for the Saturday. U of Ottawa will take on Ontario Tech. If Ontario Tech can beat Carleton and then keep it close against University of Ottawa, Ontario Tech is legit. They will be a team to watch out for. And then the other matchup will be Queens versus Carleton. So that's 3 versus, I believe Carleton is ranked 10. So that's another ranked matchup coming up this weekend. Like I said, we're going to resume the recaps next week, and I'll probably recap those games or the best results. We'll highlight a U Sports player, but I do want to shout out the University of St. Francis Xavier because they participated in the Laval holiday tournament. I believe that was last week, just before the new year. And they went undefeated. So they beat, in order, I believe it was in order, or I have this in order. They beat Laval, the University of Winnipeg, who is ranked number 6 in the country, and then they also beat the number 1 team, the University of Ottawa GGs. So we know, obviously, St. Francis Xavier is a good school. Kind of crazy that they beat the undefeated GGs. I'm not sure if that counts towards the rankings. I'm not 100% sure, but we will find out. But we'll see how U Ottawa bounces back this weekend with 2 tough matchups against Queens and Ontario Tech. Now moving on to the NCAA Canadian matchup of the week. It's a pretty easy one. It's the number 1 Purdue Boilermakers are taking on the number 9 Illinois Fighting Illini. It's Zach Eady versus Canadian Quincy Guerrier. Should be a good matchup. I'm very curious to see how this one ends up turning out here on Friday. They also play on Friday night. Kind of tough. Lots of these games happening on Friday night. I'm going to mention another game on Friday here in a moment. But we'll see how the Fighting Illini do. They did all right in their first game. I'm not going to mention it too much. You know who I'm talking about, the specific player, and the incident was all over the internet. So we won't get into that, but it'll be very interesting to see how they continue. Obviously, they're still ranked 9th, so they have to be good enough. But yeah, we will see how that goes. And obviously, we know Zach Eady's going to eat. I'm not sure how much Quincy Guerrier is obviously going to be guarding Zach Eady, but Guerrier will most likely be on the floor. We will definitely see how that one goes. It should be a really good game. And finally, the NBA Canadian matchup of the week. Another one for Friday. I know these are all the best matchups that I could choose personally, or that I chose personally. The Trailblazers and Mavericks in Dallas, Texas. Shaedon Sharpe taking on Dwight Powell. Obviously, again, they're not going to guard each other. Powell now coming off the bench because Derek Lively is surging and now starting for the Mavericks for the most part. But Powell's still a very important part of obviously the Canadian national team and a part of that Dallas Mavericks team. And Shaedon Sharpe is Shaedon Sharpe. He's just nuts. So that is it for this episode. It's going to be a good one next week. Obviously, we're going to have the same sorts of segments, but we are going to be adding in a U Sports player spotlight, the best games from that past week. We're going to hopefully get a proper player spotlight again, and hopefully we'll have some even more stuff. We got lots of stuff coming up with the Maple Minute. We just released our newsletter recently. Absolutely fantastic. If you haven't checked it out, go check it out. You can get the link. Super easy. Go to our website, read all of our articles. It's all really good content, keeps you up to date, gets you insight on all things Canadian basketball. We do all levels. all players. Hopefully going to be getting some really cool content soon. We've got lots of stuff in the works. And yeah, it's on a roll. We're in 2024 and we just keep on chugging along. I'm Elliot Russenholt. Thank you for watching. This has been the Canadian Basketball Weekly Show here on the Maple Minute. Hopefully you enjoy some basketball this weekend, and I will see you next week for episode number 4. Have a good week, everybody.